Hello. We are continuing our lessons under the theme of the autumn of awesome assurance. And it sure is hard to say, obviously, but it is a great theme that we've been studying this fall. We do have amazing assurance in Jesus Christ. And of course, very closely related to our summer of hope. And the encouragement has been amazing. I've really appreciated the outline that Greg put together for the four evangelists here, and these lessons that we've had, these scriptures and various themes to go through. So very exciting. And our autumn, of course, is going to wrap up in a few weeks, but we've got a few more of these under this theme, the autumn of awesome assurance. And tonight's lesson is my power is made perfect in weakness from 2 Corinthians 12, verse 9 specifically, but I'm going to be covering 9 and 10 as we go through this sermon this evening. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Paul here is nearing the end of his second letter that we have to the church in Corinth. And he's told them, I prayed for this thorn in the flesh. And you know what? This was Christ's response to that. My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. And of course, his grace is sufficient for all of us as well. So no matter what we're struggling with, no matter what the circumstances are in life, no matter what physical issue we may have, or emotional, or mental, or spiritual, no matter what it is, the grace of Jesus Christ is sufficient for us. We live, probably not that wild compared to some of the times in history, but we kind of think that 2020's kind of been a wild time. But you know what? No matter what the circumstances are, no matter what kind of virus we catch, no matter what happens in our lives, the grace of Jesus Christ is sufficient for us. This is an eternal truth. This always has been true, and this always will be true. The grace of Jesus Christ is tremendous, and that's our first major heading for this evening. The grace of God, it's been defined in so many different ways. Unmerited favor, a gift, are the main ones we use, and these are appropriate. Grace is a blessing. Grace is a pouring out of God to us. Grace is, as far as Christ is concerned, sufficient for us. It is coupled here with Christ's power. My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. And then Paul says, you know what? Therefore I'll boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. And so what I want us to do is really talk about the grace and the power together. And I want us to notice the parallelism in verse 9. And notice that the grace, and of course they're both my grace, my power. These are Christ's grace and Christ's power. But his grace and his power are paralleled together, is sufficient and is made perfect are in parallel, and then for you and in weakness are in parallel. My grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. And notice the for, it's not insignificant there. My grace is sufficient for you because my power is made perfect in weakness. And that's what's happening here. When Christ gives, when Christ blesses, when he graces us, it is sufficient. And then parallel to that is when this allows his, or shows, or manifests the fact that his power is made perfect in weakness. And then I'd also like us to contrast the power with the weakness. Notice that his power is made perfect in weakness. And then Paul says, I'm going to boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses then, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. And he is not saying that he loves his weaknesses. He is not saying that he doesn't want them to go away. He is not saying that especially if it would be a spiritual weakness, a sin, he's not saying that that's something to be proud about. What he's saying is, you know what? Because this allows the power of Christ to be shown, you know what? I'm going to boast all the more gladly in those things. I'm okay with it. And he says that later. He says he's content, and that'll be our last point in just a little bit. But notice when he allows all this to take place, in other words, when he allows Christ to do the work and take the credit as opposed to himself, then Christ allows him to be strong. That's when we are the strongest, when we recognize our weaknesses, when we humble ourselves before the Lord. Those who humble themselves will be exalted. Those who exalt themselves will be humbled. The first shall be last. The last shall be first. Whoever wants to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for the sake of Christ will gain it. Over and over again, we have this theme throughout scriptures and different contrasts. For example, Isaiah 55, verses 6 through 9. Seek the Lord while he may be found. Call upon him while he is near. Let the wicked forsake his way, and the unrighteous man his thoughts. Let him return to the Lord, that he may have compassion on him, and to our God, for he will abundantly pardon. And then the ones that all of us are more familiar with, possibly. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. In Paul's first letter to the church in Corinth, he starts off the letter contrasting the wisdom of God and the wisdom of man. For the word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved it is the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the discernment of the discerning I will thwart. Where is the one who is wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? Rhetorical, the answer is yes. For since in the wisdom of God the world did not know God through wisdom, it pleased God through the folly of what we preach to save those who believe. For Jews demand signs and Greeks seek wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and folly to Gentiles. But to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God, and the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. For consider your calling, brothers. Not many of you are wise according to worldly standards. Not many were powerful. Not many were of noble birth. But God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world, even things that are not, to bring to nothing things that are, so that no human being might boast in the presence of God. And because of him, you are in Christ Jesus, who became to us wisdom from God, righteousness and sanctification and redemption, so that, as it is written, let the one who boasts boast in the Lord. Christ's grace, his gift, his blessing, his willingness to accept us when we are unacceptable, his grace is coupled with his power. Anything Christ, and I should say the Father and the Spirit, but here, anything Christ promises, he can deliver because he has the power to do it. When I think about God's grace and his power, I often think of Romans 8:28, where those who are in the Lord are promised that all things will work together for good. And only an all-powerful, all grace-filled or gracious God could make that happen. That's not natural. It's not natural for good things to come out of bad. It's because of God. It's because he is gracious to us. And he has the power. And so the same is true here in this verse. 2 Corinthians 12:9. The grace of Christ is coupled with his power. And so we read that Paul is actually content with that. He's okay with that. So Christ says, to read our verses again, my grace is sufficient for you, my power is made perfect in weakness. And Paul says, therefore I'll boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. I want the grace of God. I want the power that belongs to God to be part of my life. Now, Paul wrote in Romans 6, of course, that should we sin all the more so grace may abound? Again, he's not saying I want to be weak and I want to mess up and I want more grace. It's not in that mode at all. He's just saying, you know what? I'm glad to allow Christ's power and grace to be part of my life. Verse 10, for the sake of Christ, then, I'm content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Contentment's one of those elusive qualities that all of us want to have. We want to be content. The sad thing is the world just goes after things to become content. Oh, I'll be content if the house has another bedroom. I'll be content if we have another bathroom. I'll be content if we have a little more space in the house. I'll be content if I get a raise at work. I'll be content, fill in the blank. I'll be content if, fill in the blank. Contentment never comes from the accumulation of goods. Contentment comes in Jesus Christ. Paul was even content with all these negative things. Weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, calamities. We're going to read in a moment that he was content no matter what the circumstances. From Philippians, he says, for when I am weak, then I am strong. And there's the great practical application to self of the truth that Jesus said up in verse 9. My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. It's made complete. It's made whole. It's made perfect in weakness. Here's our Philippians passage, chapter 4, verses 10 to 13. I rejoiced in the Lord greatly that now at length you have revived your concern for me. You were indeed concerned for me, but you had no opportunity. Not that I'm speaking of being in need, for I've learned in whatever situation I am to be content. I know how to be brought low. I know how to abound. In any and every circumstance, I've learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need. I can do all things through him who strengthens me. So we come back in verse 13 to what Jesus said to him in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 9. He knows that no matter what, weaknesses, calamities, hardships, persecutions, no matter what it is, Christ, by his power, will be gracious to him. And not only gracious, sort of, but grace, of course, that is sufficient. Grace that goes all the way. Grace that will make Paul whole and ready. And the same, of course, is true for us. God doesn't go halfway. Christ doesn't go halfway. The Holy Spirit doesn't go halfway. They go all in. They are perfect. God is perfect. There's no, oh man, if God could have just given 20 more percent, everything would have been okay. No, there's none of that with God. God gives it all. God provides it all. His grace is sufficient. In this context of contentment, Paul says, I can do all things through him who strengthens me. So one more time for our verse. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. So let's put ourselves into this verse. Jesus, please take this sin away from me. Please take this weakness away from me. Please take this circumstance away from me. Please take this hardship away, this persecution, this calamity. Please take it away from me. And maybe you pray it 3 times. But he said to me, he says to you, the no is implied. No, my grace is sufficient for you. For my power is made perfect in weakness. And then we should respond as Paul responded, right? So I'll address it to you. So you've prayed. Christ has said, no, you know what? My grace is sufficient. My power is made perfect in weakness. And then you say, you know what? You boast all the more gladly of your weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon you. For the sake of Christ, then, you should be content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when you are weak, then you are strong. This passage is for all of us. Now, Paul was an apostle. He was very special. He was so dedicated. He was so faithful. You know what? We're supposed to be so dedicated and so faithful. We are supposed to be like Paul, as he is like Christ. He prayed that and wrote that for his readers. We need to be more like him. So, let's realize, no matter what is happening in our world, no matter what illnesses we may have, no matter what diseases we may get, even if we get cancer, even if we lose material goods, as Job did, no matter what happens, we need to realize that the grace of Jesus Christ is sufficient for us. He has the power to make things happen. He has the power to get us through. And so therefore we need to boast all the more gladly of our weaknesses, so that his power will rest on us. And so then we just need to be content. You know, this world is not our home. Our citizenship is in heaven. And the people in Hebrews 11 that were successful, well, all of them were, they were successful because, verses 13 through 16, because they realized that they belonged somewhere else. That was the root reason that their faith was strong, because they realized they were searching for a better country. And we are doing the same. We are people who are moving through this life. We are making this journey, and this journey's short. Our lives are like a vapor. We can do it, but the reason we can do it is because of Christ. He's the one that will give us the power and the strength and the courage to move through this life no matter what is happening in our lives. Take hold of the great promises in 2 Corinthians 12, verse 9. May the Lord bless you and keep you this week.